I wanted to make a stylized character, but I also want to keep the workflow simple. My plan is to create an animated shot using Blender, but model and paint the whole character entirely in ZBrush. This is how I created a stylized girl from a sphere. I've always wanted to make a model based on the art of Pavel. I've loved his art and his characters for a long time. Sick concepts. And I love that style that Fortiche does with Arcane and the League cinematics. Specifically this one. This is the Welcome to Noxus cinematic by Fortiche. I just love the cinematic, so I thought, let's put them together. Before jumping into the modeling, I'm gonna show you my reference board just so you can get a sense of the influences and what I'm trying to do. Okay, here's a bird's eye view of my reference board. Here is the concept that I chose. He has so many. A lot of my students have done them too. Here's one that I haven't seen anybody do. I like her, I like the color. She's got an edgy thing. She's got a very subtle expression. Let's do this. And then the style is really gonna be heavily inspired by this Welcome to Noxus trailer. Again, I just think it's so sick. So sick. This project's also inspired by Ulysses, who did almost the exact same thing with a concept by Pavel. I chatted with him about it actually on a Pixel Peeps, which you can watch on the channel and see how he did it. You can see Pavel concept on the left and his on the right. Came out fantastic. And he did a little arcane type of stuff too. His is rendered in Marmoset Toolbag. And here's an example of a similar style done by Weston Reed on Pixel Peeps 2, if you want to take a deep dive in his process here. Here's obviously Arcane, and you can actually see the 3D. Really cool of them to share this so you can see what's going on with texturing and rendering. And then obviously the shot. Like I want to make a shot in the end. Here's just some mood and lighting. You know, things are skin tones and color. Some of this, you know, might be inspirational, like the little bloom on the highlight and things like that. But this really, this trailer, this shot, this kind of vibe, really what I want to go for. The thing that makes what they're doing so cool, I think, so like visceral and exciting to me, it's the very opaque, creamy painting. You know, it makes me think of like the older paintings from like Mr. Jack and stuff. Very opaque colors. But then with this cinematic language, we see a painting and we see some cinematic lens effects, but not a lot. And that's what I like about it so much. And that's what we're gonna try to recreate. And then I just put together what I think could be a good final presentation, like this one by Alexander Navarro, which gave me ideas for what I wanted to do eventually with ArtStation. So those are the references and inspiration for the project. Now let's jump in and start the modeling. Okay, starting off this project in ZBrush with a sphere. So it's absolutely from scratch. You don't have to do that. I'm doing it for practice and also because it makes a better video, let's be honest. Okay, it's just more compelling. You could start from a base mesh, but this is cooler, right? Just extra difficult for no good reason. But in this case, it's not a huge project, so that's okay. And what I'm gonna do is push and pull this into the general shape of my character. And I know that I'm gonna texture this and have UVs and animate it in the end. That's the goal. So I know I need clean topology later. I'm gonna get it into the size and shape that I want, and then use ZRemesher and ZRemesher guides to make the mesh in a way that's pretty good for sculpting and something that I can work on as an animatable mesh later on. Not like you would in a studio, but it's totally fine. It's just a fun project. So once I have a clean mesh, then I can sculpt it a bit more and start refining the surface. Now, something that I do pretty early is add eyeballs, and I paint them. I even paint eyebrows sometimes. And it sounds simple, but it's just really important for faces as soon as possible. And it just helps make that graphic shape, lets your intuition go, and it starts to look like a face. Then I get to jump into color way earlier than I ever usually do. That's one of the main reasons why I wanted to do this project this way, so that I'm essentially getting to see my final result as I work. And to do that, I have to actually start painting. So I'm gonna switch to the flat color material because this is gonna be totally unlit at the end. So I have to paint the light myself. So now I see what I've made so far, which is just this blank silhouette, which is scary. And so this is the part of the process where I start to get a little nervous because this is all new. But I just thought, you know, what the heck, let's just jump in and start playing around and trying it. I can always bail
and just go back to Substance Painter and do a workflow that I'm more familiar with. I'm starting with the big shapes, light side, shadow side, darkest shadows, and then I'll get the highlight on the nose. At first, it feels pretty rough. But once I get the cast shadows in there from the head and the nose and everything, it starts to feel like it is getting lit, and I think it starts to feel like it could work. Now, I want to add the eye highlight. This is a very Fortishy thing, and it's a stylized character thing, is to have a graphic shape as the eye highlight. And again, getting it in here early, paint's feeling pretty good. This could kind of complete the puzzle, give us our first glimpse of what this character is going to look like in the end. And you can just fill this. So I'm filling it with a flat white color, so it's just literally a graphic shape. And I'm planning to use this exact mesh in the end for the renders. So back to painting. You know, most of this process is just see if I could figure it out. And I like the kind of sketchiness. I'm feeling pretty good. I tried a lot to make smoother strokes in ZBrush. That is something about ZBrush, is the brush kind of skipping and you just don't have that smooth, creamy brush stroke you'd have in Photoshop. I tried several things in editing settings. Honestly, the only thing that really worked was just going very slowly if I needed a smooth stroke. But mostly just painting in and out, sampling color. If you press the C key in ZBrush, it just samples. So really just spending a lot of time iterating on what I have now until it feels good. Another thing that's really useful for this project is in ZBrush, I can adjust the colors of poly paint. Honestly, pretty fun painting. It started out as being something I was extremely worried about. And then towards the end, once you get over the hump and dive in, it is fun. And it's what I hoped for. Working on the model and the texture at the same time, very nice and gratifying to just see what you're working on. At this point, the face finally felt pretty stable, which meant it was time to dive into the next big challenge that I've been putting off. The hair. The braids. I knew these braids were going to be tricky from the start, and I didn't want to sculpt them one by one. So what I did was I started by creating a custom braid brush. I built some pieces in Maya that could connect together, and I made what's called a tri-part curve brush with ZBrush. I made those 3 pieces to make the tri-part brush, which is the beginning, middle that repeats, and end. And then I brought them into ZBrush so that I could create that new brush, and then I could just draw the braid. It wasn't perfect. It's not that great of a brush in the end, but what it did was it gave me enough of a simple, really low poly mesh and the pieces I needed to push and pull and get them in the right place. Laying down the color on the braids again, fast. A little hack to get the color on the braids quick was to use the masking by curvature and mask by normals. And that really helped establish like a base lighting on the hair because it's using the actual normals of the mesh. Pretty quickly, the braids started to work, and now the model was really coming together. From there, the rest of the process really was continuing the same workflow so far and finishing the remaining pieces. I added the bangs to the hair by just drawing a mask and extracting and sculpting and painting from there. I blended the hairline with more painting in and out, sampling and painting. I refined the top of the head. And then I had to build out the rest of the models that I didn't have yet, like the piercings, the necklace, the backpack, and the arm patch. At this stage, I was feeling pretty comfortable with the workflow of making somewhat simple models, laying down color fast, using that mask by normals trick, and then, slowly just painting brushstrokes, leaving some brushstrokes visible, and trying to keep that style of this model we've been cooking up so far. And mostly it was about putting in the time in the painting and slowly refining. And then one of the last finishing touches that I wanted to add to the model is little flyaway hairs to bring more detail, scale, organic feeling to the model itself. So I did that on the top of the head in ZBrush with fiber mesh, just painted a little mask there and just, pulled out a few hairs, converted that to geometry. And then for the braids, I just did a little bit of a different method. Is I just duplicated a braid and I ripped out some of the polygon rows to create those long strips and then cranked some noise on it and then pushed and pulled it to get the similar thing. So I have these like little thin hairs, not too many, a few dozen or something to just try to break the silhouette. Again, add some scale and detail. And eventually the character, at least model, was finished. But to actually bring this character model to life, I got to move everything into Blender and start the whole process of doing all the things and learning all the things I don't know how to do yet. But first, I need to prepare the meshes, which is something I know how to do. So I know I'm going to rig and animate this, even though I don't know how yet. I know the mesh has to be reasonable. You can't be too dense because it's going to slow everything down and it won't even look that right. Say the braids, for instance, that are going to move around. So I need to make it lightweight, but keep all the detail that I have so far. So I'm going to generate new meshes. I'm going to auto UV it. I'm going to project the poly paint and then bake it to a texture. So in the end, I have meshes that are much lighter weight. Now all the poly paint is actual texture files that I can load into Blender. And then I can export the whole mesh, the new mesh version of this model as an FBX and bring that into Blender. First thing I did is I made sure the scale was right. Remember, I started from a sphere in ZBrush. That's going to get you because it's so tiny when you do that. Luckily, Blender has a global scale factor when you bring it in. So I just 100x that thing and boom, comes in pretty big. And now, first thing I'll do is make materials and load up my textures. If I just make it in emissive, then it will display the texture without lighting. It'll be full brightness. And now it's essentially unlit. So I can do that with all my different textures and I can bring this over. So now I have the model and everything in Blender. Great. Then the first big problem, rigging. Now I'm not a rigger and I'm definitely not going to build a rig from scratch. Blender's obviously got some great tools and one of them is Auto Rig Pro, which I previously purchased. A lot of people swear by it. And so I followed this tutorial and I used it to set up the rig. It's actually pretty straightforward. You know, you just follow the steps, and you put the little markers in 3D space, place the guides and everything, and then you bind the mesh. The good news was the eyes worked right away, and that's really the main reason. That's the main thing I wanted to get. You know, I want that eye control. I want the sticky eyes with the eyelids. I did forget to rig the mouth, though. Also, even though the eyes worked, the shirt was collapsing into the body, as you can see here. That looks like that's really bad. And of course, the braids aren't doing anything yet. So first I just tackled the shirt and any other problems with the skinning. I just went to weight painting and I had to add a few extra bones to kind of be the quote unquote body. Some like extra like root bones below that I could just 100% weight like the backpack and stuff. Again, I'm trying to make this simple just to make a nice subtle shot. So I'm just gonna, 100% everything to these new bones. Once I figured out how to add bones to the armature, I realized I could use that same idea for the braids. So I created a bone chain for each of them. And then I used a plugin called Wiggle 2. And this plugin I first heard from Lucrezia on her project. And so I used that to give it the physics and I attached the new bone chain to the armature. After a ton of trial and error and figuring out how to actually bind everything correctly, it actually worked. And the braids started moving. They even had physics. So that was honestly the part of the project I was most unsure about from the beginning. I thought if I can't get that to work, then I can't really animate it, So having very little experience with this side of things, especially in Blender, but once I saw the whole character animating and the braids reacting to the motion, I knew the hardest part was done. I could see the light at the end of the tunnel. So next was to do the actual animation. Again, I'm not an animator. I wanted to eventually make, a subtle shot, similar to some of the cinematic close-ups like this one to make her feel alive. So first thing I did was I shot reference of myself acting it out, and then I exported that with a frame counter as a GIF so I could bring that in pure ref to make it super easy to copy that when I blocked it out. So I blocked out the animation based on that, just rotations, big to small, doing the neck and head and eyes. And after I got that feeling pretty good with the timing, I wanted to give her a smirk. And again, remember, I forgot to rig the mouth. Looking over the footage, I actually disabled mouth. Why would I do that? I had to turn it off. I said no mouth. So I made shape keys, which in Blender, it's like morph targets. So I just duplicated the head and made a little smirk shape that I could keyframe. And that's what helped finish my little performance. Now I want to start working on the shot. If we're taking a look at the trailer for reference, I think what's really interesting is how subtle, how much they're picking and choosing which aspects of the quote unquote cinematic language that they're using. You can see things still look like a painting, right? But then we get these nice lens effects. Look at the hand cam, look at the camera work and the shake. Look at the schmutz on the lens, the dirt from this, right? To make it seem like this is a real physical camera. These are physical lenses. The way that it can be handheld and move around, that it can shake. See, now he's out of focus and now it has to pull focus on him. And just that adds that visceral feeling that even though these look like paintings moving around, it feels physical and more quote unquote realistic because we're used to these type of movements in like actual live action. And then there's the glares and flares. It's another couple elements that can help make things look cinematic or filmic. Can you see as things get bright here, they get a little bit of a soft glow, like on the parts of the armor or on the overexposed sky. This helps things from being too sharp, and again, it's like a film effect. And then if you can find an excuse for a lens flare, always good to have a lens flare. Another thing from the physical cinematic language, light going into a lens like that. And look here, like on these nice close-up right here, long lens compression, and we see the depth of field right here, and look at the bokeh. It's like anamorphic, you know, it's not spherical, it's stretched vertically like an anamorphic lens. And there's just a little bit of chromatic aberration. You can see the kind of the blue and the red splitting just a little bit, but not a lot of noise, not a lot of crunchiness, right? Not a lot of highlight roll off, not a lot of desaturation, all these kind of cliche film effects. They're just choosing a few of those camera and lens effects to make it look cinematic and epic, but still look painterly. And I think that's why it's so sick. So the first step I did was to expand the current shader setup into something a little bit more complicated that would allow me to kind of do some lighting. Now you can see in some of these stylized examples, there is still some lighting cues, but remember we started as doing something quote unquote unlit, right? But I still want to be able to have like a rim light. You see that type of effect in the cinematic here, in Valorant, in Marvel Rivals. And so to do that, we're doing it in the shader. The way I ended up doing it is here on screen. You can see this setup lets me take the actual lighting from the scene and put it on top of my unlit shader. That way I get to control the light by actually moving lights around, changing their color, changing their brightness. And that really gave me everything I needed for that. Made that a node group, and then I could add that to any other material I needed that light effect for. Once the lighting was working, then I could start really building out the shot. First was the camera move. So I wanted something subtle. So I did this kind of dolly in. A little trick for that is you use an empty object. In this case, I'm using an empty arrows object. And then I parent the camera to that. So I can easily animate the empty object as if it's the dolly and then leave the camera independent. So after I get the camera move feeling good, now I can add some subtle camera shake to the camera itself, like it's kind of bumping along to make it feel more cinematic and handheld. And so I add the camera shake using noise in Blender. And now I get that smooth dolly in and also a little bit of an organic feel. Thank you, empty arrows. Next, I'm going to add a background. I'm just going to actually do that here in Blender. You know, I'm sure the actual things do it in like comp later, but I want to just get it in there in the actual scene. I just took an image off the internet and I darkened it and made it kind of blue. I'm putting it on a big card in the background, again, unlit so that it can be full brightness. And then I tried to add a little bit of depth of field to it. And I'm just moving around to get a composition I kind of like. After I got the background feeling okay, I got the lighting, everything, it still wasn't feeling cinematic enough. So what's the first thing I thought of? Floaties. Let's add little floating particles. So I could have learned how to do that myself, but I had enough to do. So I added the floating particles using this Blender plugin to give the scene some atmosphere. That always makes it look good, right? Depth, thingies moving around. Then I added a little bloom with the glare node and compositor. Remember that little bloom on the eye highlight from the cinematic? And now the shot is starting to feel more alive. After a bunch of final like tweaks and going back and forth, playing around with the lighting, camera movement, and timing, I rendered out the animation in 4K. Now, once the render is done, it's not over. That's when you want to do your post effects. Things like color correction, compositing, adding elements, and things like that. Now, I would recommend using DaVinci Resolve because it's super powerful and free, but I'm using Final Cut Pro because I'm used to it, and that's what I'm going to use. And that's where I start to add layers, things like a vignette to darken things around, playing with the colors, the tones to make it look a little bit more filmic, and that's where I add more flares and glares to get more of that cinematic language.
So you can really do a lot with post effects, and that's a whole thing on its own, but I'm gonna flip back and forth here so you can see the render straight from Blender and with the post effects that I've added. I think the original looks a lot more like the concept, and the one with the effects looks more like some of my references. You really can change the look a lot, so I always recommend doing something to your renders after they're done. So that is the final step. We got the model, hand painted texture, unlit materials, we got the stylized lighting, camera move, atmosphere, glare, background, and here is the final shot. That is how I made this, my latest project. Thank you so much for watching the video up to this point. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you got something out of it, maybe something you can take with you and put in your own projects. I'm gonna add more behind the scenes stuff from this project along with my other ones up on my members of this channel and Patreon. Same content goes to both of those. And I also teach people how to make character models at characterclass.com. So yeah, thank you so much for watching. Make some cool shit yourself. I'll see you in the next one. Peace out.